So hello everyone. My name is Austin Wright. A quick note about myself. I intern as a contract specialist trainee for an agency in the federal government. Um, so the title of my project is Improving Federal Contracts with Women-Owned Small Businesses. You go to the next slide, please. So once again, the table of contents are about the same for everyone. So won't dwell too much on this one. So next slide, please. Okay, so about March or April of each year, the Small Business Association, they release a procurement scorecard which details the objectives and the goals that each agency wants to achieve with the small businesses. And there are several segments of small businesses, and they ultimately release a government-wide procurement scorecard. And for the small businesses, the segments that showed kind of disappointing results were women-owned small businesses and hub zone. A hub zone are economically disadvantaged regions, but the largest missed target were women-owned small businesses. Um, so once again, women-owned small businesses were not earning adequate federal contracts. Um, this past year, they only achieved 4.63% of all prime federal contracts. And prime means those are just the businesses that the federal government directly interacts with. And subcontractors, they work with the prime contractors to get the services or the products complete on time. But the 4.63% this past year was an actual decline of the 4.8% the year before. And each year for the past, I believe, 4 or 5 years that I've seen, the objective was for women-owned small businesses to receive 5% of all prime contracts. And 6.8% were a decline in the actual number of women-owned small businesses receiving contracts from 20 to 2021. So it's actually been even more of a drop-off than they desire. And the ultimate question was, why is this the trend? Next slide, please. So the problem statement I came up with was, why are women-owned small businesses not receiving the targeted value from the federal contracts awarded to small businesses? And I kind of broke this down into kind of two segments. One being what factors influence women-owned small businesses to receive contracts, and another one was what factors affected the total obligated value of those contractors. All right, next slide, please. So the agency I work for, they have created a framework, and it's explained as acquisition, innovation, and motion. And it was designed to create or increase communication between the agency and other businesses, particularly the small businesses. And that is by implementing new strategies or new practices through that creation. Um, in addition, they have events, such events such as industry days, so small businesses can inquire about what they need to necessarily get done to actually engage contracting wise with the government. Um, there are also reverse industry days, which are in the opposite, the opposite effect, in which um, the companies get to inquire the government about certain aspects they need to do to be affiliated with them. And they also can offer one-to-one vendor meetings to also engage in more direct fashion. So all acquisition professionals in the federal government and contractors who want to deal with the federal government, have to follow the FAR, which stands for Federal Acquisition Regulations. That is quote unquote the Bible for acquisition regulations. And the Part 19 is specifically created for small businesses. So that includes policies, um, regulations. It's almost like directions for companies and the federal government contracting officers to follow when engaging in market research or with companies in terms of how they will proceed with creating that contract and the evolution of that contract. And then there's the PIL, which also stands for Procurement Innovation Lab. This is more of a newer technique in which it kind of covers the gray area of the FAR. So what is not specifically defined in the FAR, contracting officers can kind of use PIL techniques to, I guess, execute the contract. This is not 100% glorified way because some contracting officers want a specific rules to follow. So it will avoid any conflicts or potential conflicts that may arise from, gray area criteria, I guess, that falls within the contract. The first primary article I got from the higher government was this past year. There was $158.7 billion awarded to small businesses, and that was an actual record high. And according to the chart on the right, in 2022, as you can see, it was the highest, and it has been a 8 or 9 year gradual increase in the total dollars obligated, which are the blue bars as indicated. The purple line above the blue bars are the actual percentage of the total dollars obligated to small businesses in comparison to all businesses. So 23% of the total dollars obligated were awarded to small businesses in comparison to all businesses. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of contradictory to that. So although there's been a record amount of dollars obligated to small businesses, the number of small businesses receiving those contracts have decreased by more than half over the past 12 years. And one of the reasons I believe so is because if it's not a fair and open competition for the contract, from what I have experienced, contracting officers who have experience with previous contracts that they believe did an excellent job, and it's not necessarily needed to compete with other contractors. They will prefer using the same contractor repeatedly. So that will kind of seem to make the other contractors or small businesses obsolete in their minds, which is it's a huge problem in terms of keeping those small businesses engaged with the federal government. It's particularly the woman-owned small businesses. In another article, they showed 99% showed frustration with the federal government because of the programs, the contracts received, and overall support from the federal government they felt wasn't enough. They actually, most of them believed that that it was not worth engaging with the federal government because there's certain certifications they have to apply for and registrations, and it costs money, and they're not guaranteed to receive a contract even after going through all those processes. And 72% said they would give the government a grade of a C or below if they needed to. Next slide, please. So then I went to get data, and I went to the USA spending database, and that holds public contracts published by every agency, federal agency, and that's millions of contracts upon millions. So what I did was from one agency, I took three components and gathered contracts from them. Um, the original output was 700,000 different contracts. And just to slightly filter that down, I just chose contracts from the past 10 years. And with the output of that raw data, they have about, actually it's a lot more than 30 variables to select from that data. And those variables are usually details or specifics of each contract's data. Next slide, please. So I wanted to filter down these variables a little more to kind of reduce the sample size. The first way was using what contracting knowledge I've learned up until this point from working, and using my peers and coworkers to kind of get their engagement, to their understanding of what would have impact. And I kind of cross-referenced with the variables that were provided in the data set. And the two that appeared the most were the labor standards and the performance-based acquisition services. The labor standards, that is usually do they meet the required standards in terms of is it a safe working environment for their employees? Um, are their actions humane, basically? And performance-based acquisition services, that if they have a past history with the federal government, then it's how well did they perform in those services or in the products, and as well as if they were not previously involved with the federal government, then what previous services can they show um, to display if they can execute that particular service for the federal government. Um, and they have to also show if their subcontractors can allow them to execute that. And then I went to eliminate even more variables that showed, especially multicollinearity. So there were variables such as potential dollar award amount and current dollar award amount, and those were similar, and some are actually the same as the total obligated dollar amount. Um, but the total obligated dollar amount was an actual specific number. It was a certain number. The other two were a bit of uncertainty around it because they can change constantly. And then there were multiple variables that were very difficult to kind of convert into dummy variables, such as the state of the place of performance. For example, trying to convert state of Oregon into possibly numerical value, or Virginia or Washington. And then finally, I filtered the place of performance to the US only to drastically reduce even more of that sample size. And I got to 2,700 contracts. And then from there, I used the RAND function in Excel to gather 1,000 of those 2,700 contracts to use for the model. Next slide, please. So I ultimately ran two different models, and I have the two final regression models on the side. One was to measure the total obligated dollars, and the other was the probability of receiving a contract for the woman-owned small business. Each model began with 6 variables. So I ran about 3 or 4 models for each one to finally get the final regression model. I had to use the regression best practices to eliminate. I actually had another data set, but the significance F was way too high and it showed that the data did not qualify to be used for regression. But for these two, they were significantly low. So I went on further with running the regressions. The first, on the top, the model shows that the default contract obligated value is around $146,000. And for each contract, for each offer that contract received, the total obligated dollar amount increased by over $208,000. And that just shows the value perceived by the contractors of that opportunity. So of course, the more offers means the more attractive that contract seemed. The labor standard codes. So if it was a yes, so it was required for the contract, the value of that contract increased by over $1 million. And that's because the cost and the constant maintenance to meet that labor standard code is somewhat expensive. And of course, they want to incentivize women-owned small businesses to pursue those type of contracts. And the award is kind of matching to that. In the second final regression model below, with the probability of receiving a federal contract, the labor standards code, once again, that had an impact. However, there was a 5% less probability chance of a woman-owned small business of receiving a contract if a labor standards code was required, because previous contractors who got awarded often showed that they were able to execute at a above par level for the federal government. Now, set-asides, those are designated contracts or dollars for certain aspects of businesses. For example, there are small business set-asides in general, so those contracts and dollar amounts will go directly to those. There are 8A subsidized set-asides, so that means the economically disadvantaged business would be awarded those. So if they only economically disadvantaged businesses were able to compete for those. And then there is also hub zone, which are economically disadvantaged regions that the businesses operate in. And so that gave it about a 20% increased chance of earning that contract if it was a required set aside. And then finally, for the solo women-owned small businesses, so that's the individual women-owned small businesses. So when I mentioned before that there were about 30 plus variables, some were actually breakdowns of other small business categories, such as the women-owned small business. There are joint venture small businesses. There are economically disadvantaged small businesses, and I believe there was also veteran-owned woman-owned small businesses. So if they were individual woman-owned small business, they had a 20% better chance of being awarded a contract in comparison. And then once again, yeah, labor standards code were significant in both models. Next slide, please. So results recommendations. So the labor's code requirements, the set-asides, and the number of offers impacted the total dollars obligated and the contract awarding the most. The issue I ran into with these regression models were that they had both very low adjusted R-squared values of 0.0 and 0.02 and 0.06. So although the variables were significant in the model, they did not explain the total outcome as much as other variables could have contributed to those values. So I believe for the next steps for this project would be to provide more variety in the data, such as with the different variables and agencies. So I only used one agency and 3 components within that, but I should have used probably many more agencies and a variety of contracts from those, and then the variables as well. In retrospect, I could have used types of contract pricing, such as fixed firm price contracts or labor hour contracts, or even time and material contracts. And that would change the value of the contracts, as well as the chance of getting those contracts. and also maybe the type of contract, if it was a delivery order, a task order, or blank purchasing agreement, and those would have been better off suited to be added with the model. And a recommendation for the agencies would be to remove unnecessary hurdles for small businesses, particularly women-owned small businesses. Like I said in the literature reviews, most of the women small business owners, they believed it wasn't worth the time and effort to attempt to get a contract from the government because of all the certifications and requirements needed to achieve that. Next slide, please.
And Austin, you are at 20 minutes, so
Okay.
wrap it up real quick, please.
Okay, I think that was just about it. I think the next slide was the references, and
Okay.
yes.
So any questions then? We'll take one question, please. And just go ahead and take yourself off of mute when you have a question. All right, I will ask one really quickly. When you looked at the multicollinearity, how did you determine there was those types of relationships? Did you graph them out? Did you do some statistical testing? And how did you work through that?
Yes, so originally I tried to graph them out.
Yeah.
And then I ultimately just released those first two because of the fact that I knew the total obligated amount was the minimum, and I knew that the potential award can fluctuate based off of if there's an extension to the contract or additional add-ons. So with those uncertainties, I just ultimately chose the total obligated as the
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. This was also quite detailed as well and really interesting work. So thank you.
Thank you.